Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more at pedalshift.net/198, and you can email the show pedalshift@pedalshift.net or call the voicemail hotline 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 198th edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name is Tim Mooney. Thank you all for joining. Anything in the news lately? Yeah, super weird out there. When we last chatted, this whole COVID-19 thing was sort of gurgling in the background and whatnot. And now it's a full-blown pandemic. I don't have to tell you this probably. I'm going to try to keep this podcast responsible related to all of that. It's certainly going to come up, but I'm going to hopefully make this podcast mostly still about bicycle touring. Now, I think that this virus and the pandemic and the impacts changes literally everything. But I do also think that there is space for bicycle touring, at least talking about it, if not doing it in a responsible way. That is my goal throughout all of this. That being said, I have been talking about, hey, come to my San Diego meetup, and hey, I'm going to fly across country. Look, the California trip, super postponed, very postponed. I'm going to talk more about that on next week's episode, which is going to be episode number 199 of the Pedalshift Project. As planned, it is going to be a preview episode of my bike tour. Just turns out it's not going to be the bike tour that I was originally planning on doing. That's going to be postponed. The missing link is going to happen down the line, and you'll hear all about it. I actually recorded sort of audio diary style my thought process as I went through all this. That's all going to be in next week's show. So what's going to be happening is we'll have the preview episode for my tour, which you'll hear about next week, and then we're going to take a week off, and that's going to be the as scheduled best of show, which is, I guess this would be officially ironic, the Brompton Ride of California from way back in the day. May as well, right? Why not? And then the following week will be episode 200, which will be Health Willing, the first of the new tour. I will mention, folks, if you are members of the Pedalshift Society, thank you for your ongoing support. Thank you in the face of all of this. Thank you. You folks will, of course, as always, receive the audio in quasi-live time. I will be sending out the feed beforehand. That will actually be sometime next week, probably certainly within the next week or so, you will get an update to where the feed lives. If you are newish to the Pedalshift Society, this is one of your benefits for signing up, and you get that in real time, the unedited audio. Sometimes it's funny because sometimes I talk only to you and I edit it out for the podcast. So if you want to hear stuff like that, Pedalshift Society. pedalshift.net/society. All right. In the meantime, one big thing that I want to mention is that I reached out to the folks from the Sprocket podcast, and one of the things in the face of all this COVID-19 stuff is this is all super weird, and hey, let's do something for our respective podcast community. By the way, if you can hear my pug snoring in the background, it's all work from home situation right now, obviously. In any event, and we came up with the idea collectively to do online happy hours. And we do this on a platform called Zoom. We can get up to 100 people in the room. We can interact with you all. We did the first one this past weekend on March 15th. We're going to do the next one this coming Friday, March 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific time. You can check out all of the details. Hopefully you're seeing it on social media by now. The details are going to be all at pedalshift.net/happy hour. That's going to be the place where we always have the info for the next happy hour. I think we're going to be doing this for the near term. It was a lot of fun. It was a little rocky. We had no idea what we were going to do in the first one. We kind of figured out. We had a chat. I think the next one's going to be a little bit better. We're going to have a topic. I'll talk about some things, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience so we can hear from you as well. Last episode, we had Eric Iverson, who's a friend of the show's, who was at Stub Stewart State Park in Oregon, and we got to kind of see the outdoors through his camera phone. So that was kind of awesome. So hopefully, if you're in a cool place, we'll be able to show that to folks as well. So check that all out. March 20th, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, pedalshift.net/happy hour. I hope to see you all there. Next up on the show is an interview that I've been wanting to do for literally months now. We're getting to chat again with Maggie Lonergan. I want to make sure that if you haven't heard her first time on the pod, go check that out. We talk all about bike rafting back in episode number 164. So that's pedalshift.net/164. A reminder for those of you who have forgotten about Maggie, how dare you? Maggie Lonergan lives in San Francisco, still holding on to her New England ways. She spent the last decade learning to balance big adventures with explorations in daily life. She spends her work weeks exploring the Bay Area in the water and by bike, occasionally taking a long hike up a mountain that is too daunting to ride up. She named her website after her yoga teaching business, Hiccuping Yogi, as a nod to her chronic hiccups. She treats it as a frequent reminder that sometimes things happen that we can't control. Oh, wow. She wrote that before all of this. Awesome. Although she doesn't teach much these days, she's kept the name because her adventure background started with thousands of hours on the mat. And it's a good reminder that everything comes back to the breath. I am joined once again on the Pedalshift project with Maggie Lonergan. Maggie, how the heck are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well right now, all things considered. So
yeah. As we mentioned on the first time you were on the show, you are in San Francisco. How's everything there? We are speaking on St. Patrick's Day. Oh, by the way, happy St. Patrick's Day. But how is everything over there?
So as of midnight this previous night, we're on a shelter in place order, which I think yesterday I misunderstood. I thought it meant like we were literally like on lockdown. Right now, what it means is that you can still go outside, you can still be around other people, but not, the idea is to keep at least a 6-foot distance from other people and not go in like indoor crowded spaces. So no restaurants or concerts or going to work or anything. It actually hasn't really affected my life that much right now. They canceled our school last week already, so that was happening. But yeah, I've still been able to go out for a swim every day and, just go to I like the secluded beaches anyways, so that hasn't been too much of an issue for the time being.
Well, that's really good. I'm glad to hear that. I just learned from a friend of mine who also lives in San Francisco that Spain and Italy have banned cycling. So I don't know if that's in our future, but I hope it's not. But yikes.
Cycling ban at least was to prevent like unnecessary injuries related to cycling as opposed to disease transmission.
Well, that makes sense because, of course, we don't want to clog the hospitals up. So, be smart out there, everyone. That's sort of my mantra in all of this.
Yeah.
So, hey, you went on an incredible journey, an incredible adventure in Norway, and that's what I really wanted to focus on for this show. Last time we had talked, you had done your bike rafting adventure. What got you interested in doing this big adventure in Norway, and what were your kind of plans, kind of broadly speaking, going into it?
Yeah, so I think this ultimately goes back probably even before I really got into cycling. For whatever reason, I don't know exactly. It's probably related to like me reading everything I could about kind of old school polar exploration or, the Viking exploration of the North Atlantic. But I've always just kind of been interested in the really like high latitude civilizations. And Norway specifically is really about as far north as you can get for kind of major population centers. And when I first bought a bike, I was living in DC and I had taken 2 semesters of Swedish lessons and 1 semester of Finnish. The idea I was thinking at the time of going to grad school in Scandinavia. So like the idea was already there. And then as soon as I bought the bike, and this is before I even got into bike touring at all. The idea of riding around like the Arctic Circle in the middle of summer when there was no darkness just really jumped out, and the idea just never really went away. And things kind of all started to come together in my life, and I decided about a year and a half, I think, before I went on this trip. I kind of just said I'm going to do this, and spent the next year and a half preparing myself for it.
So anytime you're kind of going from, one end of a country all the way across the country, all the way across the Atlantic to get to any place, you have to have some kind of a strategy for your gear. And It strikes me that your trip had some kind of specialized components to it requiring specialized gear. But what was your strategy just to get everything from San Francisco to Europe?
Yeah, so I just flew with everything. I flew on Norwegian Air, and I can't remember how much it was, but I basically flew with my bike in the bag, and I packed. It's a soft-sided bag, so I packed almost all my gear in the bag with the bike to protect the bike itself. And then I had a backpack with me, and that's how I brought everything. I ended up shipping quite a bit back within a week just because I was we can get into it later, but I was just like really stressed out. And the first week of that trip was very, very rough for me. And I ended up sending back my pack raft and my stove and just some other like bulky, redundant type of gear, which I really wish I had later on in the trip. And that was the whole point. I had been bringing it so I could use it in Finland, but it was so far into the future that at that point I just needed to get it off my hands. And so I ended up sending it back to the States. But I think I packed quite a bit lighter than most people that I saw. Still like a very full 4 pannier setup. But in those conditions, there's a lot more gear that is required than most kind of traditional bike touring. So, but yeah, I was able to fly with everything. Norwegian Air had no problems with it.
That's really great. And what was the name of that because was this the same soft-sided bag that you used for that bike rafting trip? Yeah. What was that again?
It's called the Dog's Body bag by Ground Effect. It's a New Zealand-based company. And yeah, it folds down. It's soft-sided. It folds down. So I actually just stuffed it in the bottom of my pannier and rode with it the entire trip. Never needed it again, but I figured if I had to pack it to get on a train or something somewhere, at least I didn't have to worry about. And it meant that I could ride. I ended up just riding straight to the airport in Helsinki, which was one of the easiest, bike to airport experiences I've ever had. So I just rode right to the baggage counter in Helsinki and packed it up there.
That's really amazing. That item alone, I think, for somebody who's kind of flown with a lot of bikes in the past, that's pretty amazing because I've hunted for bike shops and boxes and stuff like that. And I do have a bike bag, but it's absolutely impossible to carry with me. So that's fine if I have a loop kind of a tour, but I love the idea of being able to bring your bag with you. So that's that. I may be looking into that in the future. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it takes up space in the pannier, but it's the amount of stress it reduces. It's worth it.
Oh man, definitely. What was your planned route when you got there? And as we've kind of previewed, you sort of deviated from that plan. What was your planned route, and what sort of occurred that got you to deviate?
Yeah, so my rough plan was I did fly into Bergen, and then I planned roughly to go to Nordkap, which is the northernmost point in continental Europe. I had no real need to go to Nordkap. Like I wasn't, I think sometimes people go on these trips, like point A to point B. And if I never got to Nordkap, it really wouldn't have bothered me. Like I'd seen enough things about the weather up there. I had no desire to ride through like 60-mile-per-hour winds just to say I went to the northernmost point in Europe. So that was the rough plan. And yeah, I didn't really look up any routes or whatever. I just figured kind of roughly hug the coast. In a country that's lined with fjords and islands, though, that's actually like a lot harder to do than it sounds. So when I was in like real heavy fjord country just north of Bergen, without a real plan, I just kind of kept getting twisted and riding down fjords and climbing over mountains and getting stuck on the other side of them. And yeah, there's just a lot of, after a couple of days, I needed to sit and make a real plan because just half-ass winging it just wasn't really going to work.
When we had this conversation before, it struck me that you were maybe a little bit more of a planner. Where do you kind of fit in that planner versus non-planner kind of dynamic?
I think it's a spot that people who are like me really understand, and otherwise, like people tend to have a hard time understanding it. I think I'm very much a planner in that I like to make like contingency plans. Where do I need? What are the non-negotiables of this, and how can I work with that? So like, when do I have, like, when does my visa run out? What type of weather could I run into? Where are some, potential like political problems or, epidemiological problems, whatever. And then outside of those like really fixed parameters, just let it kind of anything goes. So for me, I think the fact that, especially when I got to Bergen, the only real parameter I had was that I had 90 days in Europe, and it was so much freedom that in some ways I think I needed to add a few more parameters in there, like get to NorCap for midsummer, which was a few weeks, about a month or so away at that point. Or I was meeting a friend to help him film a documentary in Tromsø later in the summer. So there were a few other things that I think I just needed to add in there to add a little more structure so that these plans, so that I could form some tighter plans.
Sounds like fjords plus paradox of choice equals need more structure.
Yes. Yes.
So my buddy MJ, who's coincidentally also a San Francisco resident as well, he cycled Norway around the same time and ran into a ton of what I will put words in his mouth, soul-sucking rain, and it just really just battered him in the face a lot. What was your experience in the ride? And assuming it was you ran into it, what's your favorite rain gear that you recommend?
Yeah, so I ran into the rain. I don't think it affected me as much as other people. It definitely was soul sucking in some ways, but in order to fund my trip, I did a lot of food delivery on my bike in San Francisco, and I wanted to test out my rain gear. So I intentionally went out in for these 4-hour long shifts delivering takeout in heavy rain in San Francisco. So I had my rain gear and my understanding of how to handle a loaded bike in the rain, pretty dialed down by the time I got to Norway. And I do a ton of cold water swimming. So my body's ability to function in a very damp, cold, wet environment is a lot better than almost anyone else's realistically. So, so the rain itself for me wasn't a huge problem. The biggest issue was the ground being soaking wet. And I had a hammock set up. I had a tent set up with me for more flexibility. And Norway doesn't have a ton of trees, but it also doesn't have a ton of flat ground or ground that isn't super boggy when it rains. So actually just finding a place to sleep was the most stressful part of the rain for me.
That's really interesting because MJ ended up in a lot of hotels. I would hear from him then, and that's not super unusual that he'll usually be out in the backcountry for a while, and then I'll hear from him when he's got internet access, and usually that's in a hotel. But there were times when he's like, yeah, the wheel's totally busted and I'm in this really remote town and it's raining every day. I'm like, sounds like fun.
Yeah, there was a week period where I was in a lot of the campgrounds have these little cabins you can rent. So I did that, I think maybe a grand total of a week. But almost all of those nights were within a 2-week period. And they're fairly bare bones, but they have a space heater. You can dry your gear out. And that's as much as I really needed at that point. And yeah, the real issue with the rain for me actually was finding a place to sleep and having a place to dry your stuff. Riding in it was not an issue. The rain gear that I used a full jacket, rain pants. I had shoe covers, which for me, I was just riding in sneakers. So I just used shoe covers that had a full bottom. There was no hole cut for the cleat in them. Every once in a while, I used a helmet cover, and I used all of that from Showers Pass, which I believe is based up in Portland, Oregon.
Yes, it is. That is my brand of choice as well. Boy, they make good stuff.
They do. The other one I used was Sealskins, which is a British company, and I used they make waterproof socks and gloves, and I had 2 pairs of gloves I alternated between, one from Sealskins and one from Showers Pass, and they were amazing. My hands were fine the whole time. My feet were never soaking wet or cold or damp or anything. And then just a lot of wool layers underneath that to manage moisture, because sometimes on these extended climbs, so you're sweating in the rain and trying to the whole trip was really an exercise in moisture management.
That sounds about right. Did you, when you were sleeping outside, what was sort of the mix between hammock and tent? It sounds like that really was dependent on what the ground was like, but I'm curious, what was your mix? Yeah,
in Norway, I generally use the tent just because actually finding trees to hang from is not super easy. I do wish that I had brought. So my planning was that I would mostly use the hammock in Finland, where it was quite a bit warmer. So I used a summer weight underquilt for my hammock and a summer weight top quilt, and then inside the tent, I would stack both quilts, so it was like a full winter weight quilt when the two were combined. Um, there were a few times in northern Norway where I had trees, but it was too cold to only use the summer weight quilts. So I wish I had brought a little bit of a heavier underquilt for my hammock. It would have opened up some more camping possibilities up north, but generally speaking, the tent was fine. And even like around midsummer, even up north, it was once the sun was out and it wasn't raining, even the summer weight quilts were okay in the hammock. So Finland was almost exclusively hammocking. Like Finland's just full of trees and not a lot of flat ground, so it was kind of perfect.
I'm writing that down. Finland full of trees. Good to know for the hammock folks, right? So way up north where you were, Arctic Circle-ish, means, as you mentioned before, summer is pretty much 24 hours of daylight. How did that impact your riding, your attitude, everything that I've ever talked, whenever I've ever talked to anybody who's been up that direction, they're sort of like they are active for like 18 hours. You know, the sunlight just extends their day, and they do so many more miles than they would have in, you know, lower, well, would it be lower, not altitude, but lower longitude or latitude. I should know this before I talk about it, but anyways, you know what I mean. How did that impact you?
So the first few weeks where I didn't really have any darkness, it was so rainy and overcast that I didn't see the sun anyways. So it was, I mean, you can tell it wasn't dark. It was just kind of that gray, foggy haze all the time. And I think this actually like was part of the reason I was having trouble the beginning of my trip, because I flew into Bergen, and when I was there was about 3 hours of proper darkness every night. And I've never had jet lag before, but I was having a lot of trouble with jet lag in Bergen. And I think the real issue was like, I would go to sleep, you know, you kind of get triggered to go to sleep when it becomes dark. And I would go to sleep, and then 3 hours later, I'd be triggered to wake up again. And, you know, already traveling and everything, it affected my sleep, and then that affected my eating schedule, and everything just, I think, kind of came to a head, and it just really didn't work well. And once I got farther north where there wasn't that darkness anymore, pretty much all my issues seemed to go away. When I got farther north and I first started seeing the sun again, the first thing I actually did was like I took a day off, because when the weather is terrible, the best thing to do is just ride your bike, because it's not one day of bad weather. It's going to be bad weather every day. So the easiest way to stay warm was to just keep riding. So the first real nice day I had, I took the day off. I just laid on the beach. I sunbathed, which I know this isn't a visual format, but you know how white I am, and I never sunbathe. But up there I could, because I could go out at the middle of the day and just bask in the sun, and it was amazing. Yeah, and then I'm a total night owl, and I didn't know how that would affect me. So, but I kept a pretty regular schedule, all things considered. Like I'd wake up around 11 a.m. every day. I'd have a really leisurely breakfast. I'd start riding like in the middle of the afternoon. I'd stop riding late in the day. Like, I mean, there were days I didn't start riding until almost 7 p.m. and I'd ride until 1 or 2 a.m. some days, set up camp. It really wasn't an issue. Like people around all the time. The only problem with this really is just the ferry schedule, and that was about it.
So your ride kind of, I mean, you described it or alluded to it, that it took a turn where you're like, okay, I don't want to haul all of this stuff. And it sounded like you made some kind of calls in the middle of it where, well, you just called audibles, you know, talk a little bit about that and sort of how that impacted things, both kind of in the moment and then the consequences later on.
Yeah. So the biggest one was after, I mean, I spent an extra day in Bergen because I was so kind of disoriented when I got there. And then I rode for maybe 3 days. And of course, it was like perfect weather. Bergen is the rainiest city in Europe. And it was probably the best weather I had for the entire trip was my time around Bergen. So go figure. And I just wasn't I just wasn't feeling it. I was getting lost. I was hungry. I wasn't sleeping properly. And I got to a town and I took a day to kind of sit on it. And I ended up just taking the bus up to Trondheim at that point. I just couldn't really, I kept looking at maps and I couldn't really figure out a good way to get myself from this town, Fjorda, to Trondheim. And I was already in a major town with a bus that ran every day and figured, why not just do it? And that was, I think, the best decision I had. I kind of reset the trip. And in my head, the trip really ended up being like from Trondheim to Nordkapp as opposed to from Bergen to Nordkapp.
So, I mean, I guess I'm circling back to a coronavirus here with my last question. So I feel like the 2020 trips, bicycling trips to Norway, especially from people from the States, if you're not in Norway, well, they may be a bit up in the air right now, but at some point, everybody will have the ability to move around a little bit better globally. What would be your number one tip to somebody that's looking to tackle a similar ride to what you did?
Yeah, at least touring the coast in Norway is kind of like it's advanced bike touring. I would not suggest doing it if you don't have any outdoor experience or you have very little experience in a bike. Keep in mind, this is the major road running along the coast. Like, this is as populated as this place gets. And there were days when I never went through a town. I always had a couple extra days of food with me just because you didn't always run into a town, or you got there and the market was closed. I fortunately didn't have a single mechanical. I didn't even draw my chain once, but you need to be prepared to fix your bike. There's a bus that runs through every day, so there is a little bit of a backup, but I wouldn't bank on it. And the weather is, like, as we've talked already, the weather is not great. It turns on a dime. I think the rain is what everyone thinks of, but for me, the wind was way worse. I got stuck in a storm. I actually had to sit out. I just rented a cabin and sat for 3 days. The wind was blowing steadily over 30 miles an hour and gusting well over 40, which is getting in to real gale territory. And people weren't even driving. The wind was so strong. So you have to be prepared to just know your limits. And it's a beautiful country and the people are fantastic. And the weather is really an integral part, I think, of the whole experience. But if you are not the type of person who can watch a storm and think that this is really interesting, and if you want that warm weather or the sun and, dry, perfect ground, it's not the ride for you. It's rough, and I have a much deeper appreciation for Norwegians and their culture and how it's they really had to work to build this place and really, survive and thrive there. And yeah, it's a beautiful ride. Make sure you have experience riding in the rain and the wind and the cold, because it's not the same as going for a ride in the cold and coming back to your nice warm house and warming up. You are in the cold all the time. And if you don't know how to manage your diet and manage moisture and everything, you can put yourself in a really bad position. I have a lot of experience dealing with people who are very cold just because I swim out in San Francisco Bay without a wetsuit all the time. So for me, it's something I have a lot of experience with, and not a lot of people do on that scale. So if you're gonna go, I'd recommend getting some good cold water kind of experience just to see how your body reacts, because you lose motor function. Your brain goes a little foggy. You can get yourself into some real trouble if you don't know how you react to those situations.
It sounds like that's one of those types of trips that's, classic type 2 kind of fun, where it's you're just going to be punished and punished and punished, but the rewards for that punishment are so great that if you can handle it, if you've got the tools like you just described, this is kind of a trip of a lifetime. Does that sound about the right way to characterize it?
Yeah, some of the beaches in northern Norway, if you can just imagine the most picturesque, beautiful Caribbean beaches, white sand, crystal clear blue water. That's what they look like, and nobody's on them because they're so windswept and godforsaken and freezing cold. But if you want like an entire beautiful kind of this Caribbean looking beach completely to yourself for days on end, like northern Norway is the place to go.
Man, that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
Especially with everything. Yeah, I wouldn't mind a Caribbean-ish kind of beach that can be done in a big school adventure kind of thing. So that sounds pretty great. Maggie, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. What's anything? What's next on your list of things? Once we're allowed to all go out and do adventure-y things, do you have anything that's percolating?
Yeah, the immediate term, I'm training to do a Beta Breakers swim around San Francisco. So starting at the Bay Bridge and swimming all the way out through the Golden Gate to Ocean Beach. So it's about a 10-mile swim, and it ends in the rough surf there. So it should be a good thing. And then that's sort of the start of my goodbye tour to San Francisco. I'm going to grad school in the fall. So still have to decide exactly where. It's not quite official yet, but yeah, not in San Francisco. Like kind of this whole Norwegian Finnish thing really made me realize that is definitely the path I want to go down in life. So I'm going to go to school to study like glaciers and high latitude environments in general, kind of Arctic climate type of studies. So yeah, so hopefully I will end up back in Norway or Helsinki or something sometime in the next few years.
That's really amazing. And I have to say, everybody, if you don't have a picture in your mind of the swim that Maggie is about to do, go look at a map of the city of San Francisco and just connect those dots, but do it in the water. Most people would go ride a cable car or something to say goodbye to San Francisco. This is substantially more badass.
Yeah, it should be pretty good.
I think so. Maggie, thanks so much for joining, and good luck with everything. Good luck with sheltering in place. Good luck with your swim, and good luck with grad school.
Thank you.
Big thanks to Maggie for coming on the show. Always a pleasure. And I just think that Norway is a fascinating place, and what an amazing place to do a ride. And it's definitely, it's potentially on my list, I have to say. There's so many great places, and I just hear about these great stories, and it's just sort of like, oh, I want to go there. I want to go there. I want to go there. And it's all going to happen. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours like the Kessel Run and the Missing Link bike tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Didis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Stuart Buchan, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robert, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Dan Gebhardt, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemas, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Tom Bilch, Ronald Piroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Letko, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Kevin Olhausen, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCulloch, and John Hickman. And thanks also to all past and anonymous members for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.